Okay, so welcome everyone. We're looking at Orwell's 1984 and coming to the conclusion of the course. And these final two works, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and George Orwell's 1984, which I'm taking out of sequence. I probably shouldn't. I should flip them around. But they are as they are on the syllabus right now, so we will do 1984. I have put on the course. I can't remember when I decided to do that, but it was several years ago when I found out that they were no longer being taught in public schools as they were for decades. And I was surprised by that fact and a little bit appalled and concerned, because I think that they are pretty good works of literature, which I read in the 12th grade back in the day. And I remember being very interested in what they were talking about, and it seemed very relevant, as in seemed to be very much a commentary on contemporary matters as well. Now, I did 1984. I'm happy to date myself. I read 1984 in 1984. So, yeah, shows how old I am. You weren't born in 1984. And I read it then, and this is in the middle or towards the end of the Cold War. So by that point, we have the Western world, the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies and satellites around the world. So there's a communist bloc, and then there's a Western nations that stood for freedom, something like that. That was the backdrop for 1984 for me. That world no longer exists, obviously, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and its breaking up into various countries, Russia being the largest of the states there. But the Cold War gave way to a different world order, and I think in many ways, and you can correct me on this, and I'm interested in your thoughts, it seems to me that the warnings that Orwell presents in 1984 seem to apply as much to our world as they did in 1984, let alone in 1948 or 49 when he wrote the book or published the book. Because he was writing about a Stalinist regime, and Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time and pushing communism in an authoritarian fashion. And Orwell is imagining what the future will look like if other states move in the same direction, and he believed that that would happen, and that there would be three blocks that would effectively three global powers, superpowers as it were, who would be vying with much the same sort of authoritarian communist regimes in which they would be operating. And he probably got some of this idea, or the idea of three states. In fact, I know he did, because he mentions it, from a man by the name of James Burnham. He writes a book that's been cited recently, in recent years at any rate, called The Managerial Revolution. I have no idea if anybody's heard of this book or read this book. I rather doubt it. But the Managerial Revolution talks about a sort of elite group of managers, bureaucrats that from the top act as an oligarchy and direct society in a way that is contrary to the democracies in which they allegedly operate. And they impose a surveillance society and various techniques of promoting social cohesion, which in Orwell's estimation are nothing other than totalitarian. And with technology having advanced as it has in my lifetime, and even in your lifetime, it's now the case that what Orwell projects as futuristic technological means of surveillance are not things that are for the future, they're for the present. So I'm recording this on a smartphone, and I could be doing it live and have that being watched in another place on the other side of the world, but I can be surveilled at the same time through the same technology. As you know, through social media and so forth, your habits are tracked, and ads are pushed to you on the basis of what you regularly watch, and it feeds you things that you're interested in. If you're interested in silly cats, like my son is, then you will watch silly cat videos in which cats are talking and doing funny things and people superimpose. So then it will regularly push you things, and then it will age profile you, and you're located here, and so it will start adapting to you, and it's clear then that you are being surveilled, even if it's passively. Now, Orwell takes that and pushes it to the next level in considering what the consequences of that will be if people in a position of authority and power are acting not in the best interests of everyone, but rather in their own best interests, and have no care or concern whether the people that they are ruling over are being oppressed or not in the process. And that is because both Orwell and Huxley are continuing on the process that we've observed from the Enlightenment onward of a depersonalization of life, a loss of the integrity of what I described as the biblical understanding of human nature, which is that we bear the imago Dei. I will write this down because I see it in essays and people get it wrong because I have not written it down in part. In imago Dei, or in other words, in the image of God, which is a biblical assertion from Genesis 1:26-27. So God created man in the image of God, created he him, male and female created he them. That understanding is the root assertion in Scripture about who we are in relation to who God is. And the effect of that is to create the category of personhood, because God in his person is tripersonal. So discussions of the Trinity talk about the three persons of God: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, which has the corollary, if we're made in the image of God, that we also are persons. And persons have certain attributes. One of them is that persons have the capacity to speak and to be understood, and can communicate through personal communication, which we call language. Animals don't communicate in speech in that way. They don't have rational minds. They make noises. They understand the noises that they make, but they're not conveying rational information and understanding, and let alone relating in the sense that we have a unique individual in front of us in the same way everyone in this room, although we are all different, are also all unique. So there's no one exactly like you as a person. There's an individual there, in which we don't get in the animal kingdom. Although we anthropomorphize animals and we give them a name and so forth, a cat is a cat, basically. Cats are not persons. Cats don't have moral natures. Cats don't. So if a cat scratches you, it's not a bad cat. If a person scratches you, you will say that the person is out of control or has hurt you, and you'll want to attribute some sort of explanation for what they've done because they've harmed you. You'd say, well, they attacked me, or they inadvertently scratched me, and maybe they need to cut their nails or whatever. But you'll want to come up with some reason why the scratch that you've received may or may not be a moral assault, because an assault has happened because that person who's assaulted you has a moral nature, because God has a moral nature, and so do we. So that declaration of the personhood of a human being has filtered throughout the course. And by the 18th century, we've seen that through the perspective of modern science and Enlightenment rationalistic thinking, that the idea that we are persons is seen as, by the scientists, as a sort of a metaphor. We anthropomorphize ourselves, if that makes any sense. The scientists effectively say that the idea that human nature is personal and that we have a certain special status among all the creatures of the earth. They say that that is an anthropomorphism on our part. We're humanizing ourselves. And there's no such basis for that humanizing, because we're just animals like other animals. And Charles Darwin will come along and give the theory of evolution that will explain why we are just like animals, and we've evolved the capacity for speech, for example. But it's not part of our original nature, whereas the biblical account says that speech comes with being made in the image of God, and so does reasoning. It's not an attribute that evolves later. It comes from the beginning. It's part of being a human being, having the capacity for rational thought and the capacity for speech. And it in that sense, we bear the image of God. And those two things are coupled with a third thing, which is that we have a moral nature. When God declares that his creation is good and human beings are very good or good, God is showing that moral considerations are part of his nature, and also that we who bear his image are therefore also moral beings. Now, I've talked about this in the class at various points. These are distinctively biblical doctrines, views of human nature, but as we've seen from the 18th century onward, that sort of understanding starts to fade away and get replaced with a allegedly scientific and increasingly depersonalized view of human life. And the first expression of that, which we saw, was in A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, remember? So in the name of utility and practicality, and in the name of ethics even, he proposed that we eat people, because it was a practical thing to do. And he argued for even the ethical goodness that would come from eating babies, because it would make people prize marriage more, and they would make them want to love their wives more, because their wives would be the source of income for them. And he's commodifying human nature as if it's something that we can sell. And you will notice that understanding is concurrent with the African slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade is happening right while Swift is writing A Modest Proposal. This idea that human nature is something that we can buy and sell is very easy for his audience to accept, because they have rejected the idea that a human being bears the image of God and you may not treat them as a thing. Right? So this is a long time down the road. And if it is the case that human beings are not special and unique, and an individual is not special and unique, then it stands to reason that people with power and means do not need to treat other people as having any special integrity. In fact, they can do what they want with them. And C.S. Lewis writes a book on this, and I encourage you to read it. I will eventually, if you're in my class, require you to read it. But it's called, where is the eraser here? It's called The Abolition of Man. And I'm not going to read it on this course, because it's not a work of literature. But I would encourage you to read this book, because what Lewis is describing there, and in particular in the third chapter, is how people who represent the managerial revolution that I just spoke about, bureaucrats, politicians, leaders, a class of individuals, will manage the lives of others without any consideration that the people that they are managing are actually people. They're just numbers. And the success of their project will be measured by statistics. And whether they are good policies will be whether the stats bump up or they bump down, without ever considering that the numbers that they are reading on a spreadsheet are actually individuals who have unique worth and value, and whose souls are so precious that it is the most valuable thing that Jesus says we have about ourselves. So that value on an individual life is totally lost in the 20th century. Almost. There are a few who speak against this, and C.S. Lewis and his friend J.R.R. Tolkien are among those who write strongly against that view. But Huxley and Orwell, and we're looking at Orwell here, are not Christian writers, but who observe the consequences of regarding human beings as just like numbers or animals. And the work that you might have read in school, I don't know if you did or not, is Animal Farm. It's a great way of illustrating this, is to show farmyard animals and to effectively talk about politics while actually talking about farmyard animals. But I've chosen to do this one, even though if it's a bit longer, because I think this is a more complete and important work to read, because it introduces all sorts of concepts here that pass into English vocabulary, and usually people don't know where the terms have even come from. So, and then some of you read Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. It's a pale shadow of this, quite frankly. It's dystopian fiction, but it's a certain variation of it which I think is tendentious and not as universally applicable as this one. It presents it more as there's a problem for feminism in a totalitarian society. There is a problem for females in a totalitarian society. Orwell thinks there's a bigger problem than for women. It's for everybody. So that's why we're looking at this rather than that. But the dynamic of the abuse of individuals by a social elite is the common theme here, and is to be found almost ubiquitously everywhere. So let me say, and stop and back. Any comments or questions before I move forward on this? I will give you one final thought on this. And I'm trying to think of what's the name of this? Let me talk, and then I will try and think while I talk, which is a dangerous and difficult thing to do. This book is, so I'll get rid of this and I'll think while I do this. This is published in 1949, and in terms of its themes, it is looking at the consequence of mass surveillance, of repressive regimentation of people and of behavior, and in particular of language in a society. And it looks at propaganda and the effect of propaganda. So there are two ways of assaulting a person. One is by physically assaulting a person, and the other is by verbally assaulting them. We all know these two forms of assault, and we've all suffered variations on this. The verbal assaults are more common. Verbal assaults can take a variety of forms. One can just be calling somebody names, which is already a sort of a form of dehumanization. And there are degrees of seriousness to it. Basically, a lot of banter among boys is just that. It's just banter. It's not dehumanizing. And there's a little bit of it, but it's meant in fun. But when it's done by governments, it attains a sort of a different status, and it has a far more serious character, because at that point, this is the public discourse, and the terminology that is used to make common sense of the world. Whereas if I have a funny nickname for the boy in my class and other boys adopt it, that doesn't mean that outside the confines of the classroom, everyone else is going to adopt that as the form of understanding. But if it becomes a socially mandated way of using language, then it has a different character altogether. The story here is an imagined future. Oh, I should say one final thing about the title here. Its original title, or when he was writing it, Orwell's alternative title, so this is the one he ended up with, as we know. The alternative title was The Last Man in Europe. And we're going to begin with a man by the name of Winston Smith. Winston. And he is the last man in Europe. Now, I only say that because I want you to consider, as you're reading it, or as you've read it and now are reflecting on it, in what sense could Winston Smith be considered the last man in Europe? Because obviously there are other men being described in 1984 throughout the course of the novel. But it's clear that Winston Smith is the hero of the story. I mean, he's a funny sort of hero because he's not particularly good. He's not particularly moral. He's obviously not, he doesn't have any religious convictions, so he's not a Christian character. But he's also not obviously philosophical in his interests either. He's not an obviously good man who wants to fight injustice or whatever. He is a man who thinks of himself for himself, basically, and questions the narrative that he has been taught, not because he's a particularly philosophical character, but simply because he's old enough to have remembered when things were different. So, and Big Brother, which is the phrase that the government uses to describe itself, we're your big brother, I'll put our arm around you, we're your buddy, we're your friend, is giving an account of history that he remembers was different when he actually lived through it. He remembers incidents that are non-official narrative. And so he can't forget that fact. Well, you're telling me that this is what happened, but I remember that this is what happened. So what do I do with that? And the answer is you forget what you knew and you forget what happened. It gets pushed down the memory hole. The word memory hole, or the phrase memory hole, comes directly out of 1984. And memory then gets destroyed, and the remembrance of history. This is an aspect of human nature, by the way. Human beings have memories. They have histories. They have pasts. Note that most of the books of Scripture are histories presented to us in stories. One of the genres of biblical literature that we often overlook because we find them boring is the genealogies. So-and-so was the father of this character, who was the father of this character, who was the father of this character, and then we'll be told that they die as well, and they lived this long. That's an encapsulation, but what it's suggesting is that there was an individual that had a history and a life, and some of them are brought to our attention, like a Noah, or a Jacob, or a Joseph, or a Moses, or a David. Those particular individuals, we're giving the blow-by-blow account of particular events in their lives that were of significance. So Abraham and Noah are the first two that were given a significant look into their lives. But the history of their lives and the events that happen in their lives are clearly being shown to us in the biblical account as being of significance not only for them, but for us. And so the implication of that is that human lives are meaningful. And we can learn from other people who've lived before us. And we can learn even from our own life, and we can teach what has happened in the past to future generations, and that teaching that we convey will help them navigate the world in which they live. Now, in Orwell's imagined dystopian future, history is of no purpose or meaning or significance whatsoever. And in fact, the totalitarian regime of Orwell's 1984 wants to eradicate history and its meaning because it wants to rewrite the future. And the way you rewrite the future is you control the narrative of what happened in the past. And this is what was happening in Stalin's Russia while George Orwell was writing. By the way, George Orwell was a believer in democratic socialism. He was a part of the political left, but it was the anti-Stalinist left. So it wasn't the radicals, it wasn't the authoritarians. He was more of a Trotskyite, more in the intellectual strain of things. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, they end up merging at some point. But he is looking at it from that vantage point. So the story begins, and I'm going to try and look today. I think we have 3 classes on 1984. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. So today I'm going to look at part 1. There's 3 parts to 1984. I'm roughly speaking going to try and cover part 1. I'm not going to do a very good job of it because a lot of this introduction is an introduction. So I'll deal with part 1 today and maybe a bit of part 1 next time, but then I'll move into two and part 3 I'll deal with in the third lecture. And the third part has, and I don't mean to give away the plot, but Winston Smith is in prison in part 3. And we're hoping he won't get there in the first 2 parts. So one of the reasons that the novel works for me is we get the atmosphere that is cast by Orwell very effectively in part 1. We have the sense of this mass indoctrination and threat to everything private and everything that we value in human nature as being free and rational and giving us a sense of human integrity. Winston Smith seems to represent that. I mean, again, he's not a great hero, but at least he has some sense of the importance of his own thoughts. It's a brilliant introduction, by the way. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13, one of the great opening lines of all novels. Immediately, you have a sense of something not being right, because clocks never strike 13, unless we're on the 24-hour understanding of time, but clocks don't strike 13 then. They don't have digital clocks. Right? They have a clock like Big Ben. It's hit the hour of 12 and it rings 12 times. It never rings 13 times. So something is wrong about time here and about the society that is measuring things in that way. And he will reinforce that same sense a little later on when we will find that people are encouraged to say that 2 + 2 = 5. Imagine a reality in which that is the case. And if the party tells you that 2 + 2 = 5, then it is 5. And that's, again, one of the things that Winston Smith simply can't accept. He said, but if that's true, then mathematics doesn't work. And 2 + 2 cannot equal 5 because it equals 4 and it can't equal anything else. And so there's an assault on reason that Winston Smith objects to. Because reason is the basis for our ability to understand anything, whether it's logical or illogical, whether it works or it doesn't work. If mathematics doesn't work, then it's impossible for us to even tell time. And our reason doesn't function, in which case our language is ineffective. And the assault on reason is one of the worst parts of the 20th century, and it carries on in the 21st. But Winston Smith, I carry on, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. Again, quite brilliant. The dust comes with him. And again, by the time you reach the 20th century, the novelists are depending on a whole range of associations that have been accrued over the course of time, from Homer's Odyssey and Iliad all the way, and the biblical texts all the way up to the present. So when the gritty dust comes along with Winston Smith, what does the dust symbolize? From a biblical perspective, what does dust symbolize? Who's made of dust? We are, and we go back to dust. So it's a symbol of death and dissolution. And the gritty dust comes along with him. It's a symbol of decay and death. Now, you could just say, well, dust is dust. Yes, but in the hands of an artist, it has this allusions and associations that we ought to consider in our reading. And it's certainly the intention of Orwell, I think, here, that is the case. Now, the hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. Boiled cabbage was eaten in Eastern Europe, and it's often eaten by very poor people. So it's an image immediately of poverty, which belies the assertion that he goes to Victory Mansions. It's an old, dilapidated old building. Like everything in Orwell's 1984, there is the assertion of one thing, and then the reality is the opposite. and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face more than a meter wide. So let me see if I can get this image, which is often there. I've seen it in... there we go. It's as good as anything. Oh, that's from V. Oh, well. No, maybe it's not. No, that's it, 1984. I don't know what this is. But that is from the film version. So a man with a mustache, it would be like Joseph Stalin, and his picture on a poster at the end of the hallway inside this man's apartment. Tacked to the wall, it depicted an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Why? The elevator is broken. In Victory Mansions, the elevator is non-functioning because nobody fixes it. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present, the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. Why is that? Because they're rationing electricity. These are all signs and symptoms of social and political decay. They're in war, and they're not winning the war. They're getting poorer. It'd be probably like the situation in Ukraine right now. You'll have to ration electricity because it needs to be used for the war effort, and people are just going to have to do without electricity during it's a power blackout. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up. Now, a flat is an apartment in British parlance. And Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times in the way. When you're 39, you should not be so unfit as to be unable to climb 7 flights of stairs. So he's a man in a poor state of health. He's not even 40 years of age. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. So imagine this. You might put a poster in your dorm room. This is a poster in every hallway. Everywhere you go, you see the face of Big Brother looking at you. And the effect of this is to think that you are being watched, because he's looking directly at you. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the captain beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Now, when I grew up, this made no sense whatsoever because we had televisions, and televisions used to be big things with a big back on them. Now we have flat screen televisions that you can put along your wall, and not only can you see them, you can be surveilled from the other side of it. So it makes a lot more sense. That's what Orwell is talking about here. It is something like a flat screen on the wall, which is surveilling and at the same time telling you about things that are going on that the governing party wants you to know. But it's a two-way screen. Winston turned on a switch and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The element, that telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body, merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. Why blue overalls? Because this is the working man's clothing. He's wearing blue overalls like the working classes do. I lived in Germany for 3 years, and they still wore blue overalls, interestingly. I don't know if it was always the case in Britain as well, but they did. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades in the cold of winter that had just ended. Outside, even before the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals. And though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one of the house front immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said. while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. And at the same time, there is a telescreen babbling away about the overfulfillment of the 9th third-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. It tells you things even while it's watching you. There's somebody on the other side of this screen observing you. So, this is what I wanted. I told you I could think and act at the same time. You didn't believe me, and I didn't believe myself, so that we're there together. This is the Presidio Modello, and you will see this in, I can't remember, I think it's one of the, is it Black Widow or something like that? Or one of the Marvel superheroes? This is a prison. In the center of the prison is actually the watchtower, and the prison cells are all around it. It's called a panopticon. It's part of the, oops, did I just get rid of this? I think I did. That was unfortunate. I'll just use the Wikipedia here. Model prison with a panopticon design. Panopticon design, what does that mean? It is the design created by the social philosopher and theorist Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is a utilitarian. He believes in the ethics of the greatest possible good. A calculus of pain and pleasure, he will call it. A calculation of how we create the greatest possible good, and the way in which we do this, and this is a way of building a system of control, of constant surveillance, so that the greatest possible benefit is obtained by those who are conditioning those beneath them to do the right things and to avoid the wrong things. Total control. And here it's applied to a prison. And one man can sit in the center here and observe everybody around them, because their prison cells have no walls. They have walls between them, but not on this side or that side. The light comes through and shines through. So this man can observe any of them at any one point, and they don't know whether he's looking at them or not. Now, that is the same effect that is described here in Orwell's 1984. You never know if somebody is looking at the telescreen from the other side. It's possible they're not looking at you, because they can't look at everybody all the time, but you have no idea if at that point they might be looking at you, and so you act in accordance with the fact that you know you're being surveilled at all points and all times, because it's possible. And the effect of that is the abolition of man, because you're being conditioned by people who are doing it for the sake of their own purposes and for the purposes of advancing their power at the expense of human nature. This is what Orwell is depicting. As I say, I encourage you to read Lewis's Abolition of Man this summer. It's well worth reading. It's essential reading, I would say, for anybody in any university anywhere, quite frankly. Written by a Christian, but with far more than Christian implications. And by the way, C.S. Lewis writes his own science fiction trilogy contemporaneously with this. And Aldous Huxley commented on Lewis's sci-fi trilogy and said it was very good. He didn't like the theological element to it, but he did like what he was describing here, which is the common problem of the abolition of man. Anyway, back to this. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as you remain within the field of vision, which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment, how often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to did live, from habit that became instinct in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Now, what is the effect on human nature if you believe that somebody is constantly watching you? What will it do to people? Yes. Oh, absolutely. What else will it do? Always. They will do what they're told. Why? Because they can't. Go ahead. Yes? They're being conditioned by that because they know that the consequences of not obeying are not going to escape unobserved. Now, this is, again, Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian philosophy being wedded together with technology that allows total control. I tell my kids to do things. They say yes, yes, and then they don't do it. Would I like them to do what I told them to do? Well, I wouldn't have told them to do it if I didn't want them to do it. I don't want to hear the sound of my own voice, but I don't have any way of controlling that. And do I think it's a good thing that I don't have that control, or do I think it's a bad thing? Well, quite frankly, I go back and forth on this. At the end of the day, though, if I am too controlling as a parent, it's not good for the kid's development. The child loses a sense of human agency. Their freedom is crushed. They do things for the sake of appearances rather than because they want to do the right thing. They never develop an ethical compass. They never develop a moral soul. They don't do good for the sake of good. They do it so they don't get caught. Right? Is that doing it for the right reason, or is it doing it for the wrong reason? And the answer is doing it for the wrong reason. So it creates not the abolition of human beings per se, but it does, although that ultimately does end up happening, people are being abolished, but their sense of moral agency is being killed off in them. People who are constantly being observed and conditioned will lose any sense that goodness or morality has anything to do with anything within them. It's all a superficial appearance. I have to act good because otherwise I'm going to be punished. But is there such a thing as goodness? No, there's just whatever I've been told to do. That's what good is. The party tells me to do this. I do that. That's good. That means whatever the party declares to be good is just arbitrary. They could say 2 + 2 = 5. Do I have to say it? Yes, I do. But what if I know it's wrong? Where do right and wrong come into this? The party told you to do it. So I can do the most absurd things, and I will do the most absurd things. And that's what he portrays here, is exactly a society like that. Now, I told you one bit of biography about myself, that I read this in 1984. Another is that I lived in Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I lived with a trainee surgeon who grew up in East Germany. And I learned a lot of German that way because he didn't speak English, he spoke Russian. That's the second language that was in East Germany at the time. He hated Russian, actually, but that's what he learned. At any rate, I traveled with him to Berlin at one point and met his friends who were still in East Germany. And we went right by the headquarters of the German secret police, whose name was the Stasi. You heard the Stasi before? You probably haven't in many cases, but at any rate. And the Stasi, unlike Stalin and the Russians, the Germans are very good at efficiency. Notorious, famous for efficiency. And the Stasi kept meticulous records of people. And the people that were in East Germany believed that the Stasi were everywhere and spying on them at all times. Now, what did they do in response to the fact that they believed that Big Brother was watching them and that the secret police were watching their every move? What do you think they did? What was the effect socially? One, they obeyed. They appeared to obey. They felt like they needed to do that. What was the other thing that they did, however? Nope, can't run away. There's a fence, a wall, and they shoot you if you try to get out. You can't get out. Exactly that. Because if you observed somebody do something wrong and you didn't report it, that also was a sign of your guilt. So they turned on each other and they reported it to the authorities because they knew if they didn't do that, that they might themselves be brought up on charges for being disloyal to the state. Now, a really good film, you might want to watch this, called The Lives of Others. It's about exactly this, about the German secret police. What happened while I was in Germany is the archives of the Stasi were opened up. And what they discovered in that is that the Stasi didn't actually have that many agents, but people were informing on their own families, on their best friends, on their spouses, on their parents, on their kids. They were informing because they were afraid that if they didn't do it, like the kid said something that was a little suspicious, ooh, I wonder if I should report that or not. I mean, the child didn't mean anything by it, but he did say that the leader of the Communist Party, Erich Honecker, he said that he was a pig. You know, he's just a child, but what if somebody doesn't take it as the utterance of a child and they take him to mean it seriously and they think that he's heard it from me? I better report it. And what do? They come in and grab the people and take them away. And so the fear and suspicion grows. That's the effect of a constant surveillance society. It's dehumanizing, and the dehumanization actually happens not from this guy, but from the inmates that are being surveilled. They dehumanize each other. And people are conditioned then to act as if the people that they're relating to are not people. And they act like animals that are afraid. And what are animals going to be involved in? The fight or flight reflex. Fighting is not going to do you anything because you are going to lose that fight every time. So you are afraid and you run. And who do you run to? You run to Big Brother because he's the only policeman in town. So that's what he depicts here. And he does it, I think, with great effect. So the atmosphere conveyed right at the beginning of this novel is oppressive. And it immediately makes us like Winston Smith, because Winston Smith is trying to get out of the sight lines of the telescreens. And in the corner, he's writing little things that are seditious. Things that he's not supposed to say, not supposed to write, not supposed to think. And he values that, even though the risk of doing so is his own life. He's still holding on to that because he thinks it's important to his soul and to his nature to hold on to that. And he's the only person that we meet that is like that. And so he becomes literally, as Orwell described it, at least in the alternative title, the last man in Europe. The last man who is going to act like a man and not like a beaten animal. Yes?
So physically, he's not the last man in Europe, but he's the last one in his own control?
The last one who acts as if he had something of the vestiges of what we would call a human being. I mean, surrounded by other human beings, but they have all forfeited the idea of the imago Dei that I talked about there. Individuality, freedom, a sense of beauty, a sense of rightness. No, that's not right. Like when you write tests in schools, you get right and wrong. Right and wrong, those are moral terms, actually. So people don't like it when they get wrong answers because they feel like they're being rebuked. And they are in a way. In a way. Right? It's not a moral failure, you got the answer wrong, but in a sense, there is something about right and wrong. There's a moral element to getting wrong answers. We don't take it so extreme that, if you failed your test, that you're a bad person. Nobody makes that stupid conclusion. But we feel the weight of getting a wrong answer because we are moral beings and we interpret things morally. Winston Smith has a sense of right and wrong. And what's wrong is that the party says that this happened in the past, and he knows full well that it didn't happen that way. And he can't forget it. So his moral nature is still a part of him, and he acts accordingly with that. And the part of him is in rebellion against the total control of the party, and that makes him a hero for the reader. Even though, again, he's not somebody who does admirable things, he just holds on to a shred of his individuality. And that's enough. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as he well knew, even a back can be revealing, because you can hear something and you can twitch or respond in some way. You can't see a face. A face really gives it away. One of the things that I most hated about the COVID mandates was the masking stuff, because you can't see people's faces. And people's faces reveal their thoughts, their attitude towards you, their character. I've been told by child development people that kids who were brought up with masks of people around them have been impeded in their development, and they don't socialize nearly as well. They've not caught up, because it's a developmental phase where you pick up non-verbal cues from faces and so forth, and they haven't learned that. And they haven't learned to look into a face. And if you've come at reality through a screen, it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing, in part because you see yourself on the screen, not just the other person. You often see a vision of yourself. And so that has a strange effect on how you view other people. And it's a depersonalizing effect. There are no masks in 1984. It would have been an extension of the dehumanization if they had done so. But it was safer, but it can be revealing. A kilometer away, the ministry of truth, his place of work, towered vast and white. By the way, the ministry of truth is the ministry of propaganda. We're going to quickly learn that the names of things that the party calls it are the exact opposite of what they do. It's called the ministry of truth. It is actually the ministry of propaganda, because there is no truth in this world. There is no falsehood. There's only what the party says. What the party says you agree with, and if you say something different, it's not that you've uttered falsehood, that you've committed a thought crime. You've thought something that is unthinkable and unsayable. So the party is trying to control and manipulate language through the ministry of truth. But it towered white and vast above the grimy landscape. This, he thought with a vague distaste, this was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. This is Europe. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Now, note that he appeals to his memory in the past to help him in this. One of the most malign effects of the internet is when I ask people to tell me about something, they look it up on their smartphones, because they have never memorized facts and they don't know answers to anything. They simply read up on it, which I could well do myself. When I ask people questions, I'm not asking you to do a Google search and read off the answer. I'm asking you to recall in your memory something that you've learned, which is a part of your understanding of the world. And we don't memorize anything anymore. And the effect of not memorizing is to suggest that things that happened in the past have no bearing on the present. And that makes us like animals who have no pasts. They only have the present moment. They have no understanding of past, present, and future. They have no connection to the past. So the internet, which has given us this proliferation of knowledge, has not created a sense of meaning and purpose within that. And because of that, most people today suffer from a loss of meaning in their lives. It's the effect of their own habits. It's the effect of the internet. It's the effect of smartphones. You have a comment or a question? No, not really. There's a little bit of that. It's not clear, and it's not really that important. And in fact, there are shreds of story about how it came to be, but they're being quickly obliterated by the party in charge, because it wants to suggest that the means were great, and every year that they've been in power, things get better and better. In fact, we saw that right at the beginning. It's the 9th 3-year report, and they, once again, a record high. And it's always a record high, except that everyone who's lived long enough remembers that they used to have things then which they no longer have. There's scarcity. And things are harder to come by. And so the party says success, and the people who've lived long enough know, if this is success, I don't know what failure looks like. But am I going to say anything contrary to that? No, I am not, because I'm moved by fear. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, we're told that the chief weapon of Sauron is fear. Perfect fear casts out love. That is not a quote from Scripture. It's the opposite, but it is true nonetheless. If you're afraid, you don't love. You're motivated by something that is purely negative. C.S. Lewis gives an example of if you come across a person that's drowning, you have you're sort of torn there. On the one hand, if you jump in, you might save that person, but you might also drown in the process, because the person that you jump in with, by the way, if you ever do lifeguarding, you've learned this as well, you don't jump into the water to save the person, because the person will grab your arms and pull you and hold you and drag you down, because they're full of fear, and the fear creates an adrenaline and gives them a strength, and they can actually hold on to you and inadvertently pull you down as well in the process. But on the other hand, there's this sense, the fear of self-preservation that comes then from not wanting to go in, but then there's also something that drives you that says that you ought to do this. And so there's this dual impulse between something that you feel you ought to do and something that you're afraid of doing. And that tension there is there in every moral act. But if you're driven by fear, you will never do a good thing, and you will never look after your neighbor as yourself. Ever. And a society that's planned in the way that 1984 is drives out good actions. So a totally planned society. And I will say very openly now that we are moving more and more towards an openly planned society. More and more. In the name of saving the planet. In the name of building back better. We're going to destroy what is to make it better going forward. Who's to say that it's better? If it's totally managed like that, is it actually going to be better, or are we simply going to agree that it's better? Because if we don't agree that it's better, there will be consequences for that. The ministry of truth, mini-true in Newspeak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up terrace after terrace, 300 meters in the air. I think it's something like this. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out its white face and elegant lettering, the 3 slogans of the party. And the 3 slogans of the party are clear contradictions. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Now, if you say that war is peace, and the laws of logic apply, and by the way, Aristotle says if the laws of logic don't apply, then thinking is impossible. But to say that war is peace is to say that war equals peace. It's called the law of identity. 3 laws of logic, says Aristotle: the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. There is no middle ground between those. It's either identical with that, or it is non-identical with it, or it contradicts it. Now, war and peace are contradictions. If you have war, you don't have peace. If you have freedom, you don't have slavery. And if you have ignorance, you don't have strength. But according to the party, these are identical statements, that war is peace and that freedom is slavery and vice versa, because you can flip them around and so forth. In other words, this is a place in which the laws of logic do not apply, and the law of non-contradiction is not a law anymore because the party has obliterated the law of non-contradiction. Comment or question? Very good. Yes? You want to say more? Or that's just that? I mean, yes, it is like Milton's Satan, who says, evil be thou my good. So first he says that it be so, and then he says the mind is its own place and can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matter where I be, if I be still the same and all that I ought to be? Doesn't matter if I'm in heaven, I'm in hell, as long as I believe it is so, it is so. Now, the extension of that societally is to have the party state that we're in heaven, even though we're in hell. And what we could imagine to be a heaven is actually a hell. It can flip it around, and everything that is actually good, they can say that's the worst thing imaginable, and we will agree with them. That's correct. So it is an extension of the satanic mindset as well. That's a very good observation. And remember, it's a mentally constructed thing that Satan claims to be able to do, to create reality in accordance with his decision to make it so, because the mind is its own place. The party just simply says the party is everywhere, and the party determines reality, and that makes it so. And Winston Smith wants to say, but that he doesn't say, no, I'm going to fight you. He says, well, that can't be right. He's just puzzled. He's not so thoroughly indoctrinated that he can go along with it. He's just a little bit puzzled, and he will get to the point where then, and the ministry of love, so there are different ministries here. The ministry of truth, concerned with news, entertainment, education, the fine arts. Now, that's already going to strike you because the ministry of truth is concerned with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. Well, those are very different things thrown under truth. Ministry of peace, which concerns itself with war. Ministry of love, which maintain law and order. Oh, okay. And the ministry of plenty, which was responsible for academic affairs. Many true, many pacts, many love, many plenty. The ministry of love is the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. He'd never been inside of it. By the way, the ministry of love is a prison. It's a correction institution. It was impossible to enter except on official business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun nests. Even the streets leading up to its outer barriers were roamed by guerrilla-faced guards in black uniforms armed with jointed truncheons. You get some victory gin and victory cigarettes, and then he writes in small, clumsy letters, April 4th, 1984. Now, what is he doing here? He's committing a treasonous act. How? He remembers the date and the time in accordance with dictates that pre-existed the party. Who says it's April 4th, 1984? Who says it? You can say Winston Smith writes it, but why does he write it? And you could say, well, because it is April 4th, 1984. According to whom? According to whom is it April 4th, 1984? Okay, so it is March 24th, 2025. It says that on the computer screen here. How come? Why is it that date? Who decided that it was that date? The computer says it, but why is it that date? Yes? Because the decision was made culturally at the year 0, year of our Lord, Anno Domini, that was year 0, and everything before that was before Christ, and then we have the year of our Lord, and that was the time. And so in accordance with that Christological understanding of time, we are governing our clocks, and we are using conceptions of time that have been inherited from the Greco-Roman world and the Egyptians and so forth. But the actual chronology is centered around Christ. Now, he is not making a Christian profession in any way by acknowledging this timeline. It seems objective. And that's the point, though, is that the objective standard of time is inherently Christological. And it doesn't matter if you want to call it BCE or whatever bananas they come up with, BC and CDE. I can't even remember what it is now. It doesn't make a difference. It's the same timeline. And this, he writes it down in small, clumsy letters, and then he sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that it was 1984. It must be around that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39. And he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945, but it was never quite possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? You write a diary for yourself, right? It's your own private recollection of time. But is it for him that he's writing this? He's not sure. There's a disorienting effect of totalitarian control as well, which is that you're not even sure that you can trust your own sense of reality there. Are you in, like a later film, The Matrix will portray this. Am I living in reality, or is the reality what everybody else is living in? Because I'm thinking maybe I'm crazy. Because I'm seeing this and everybody else is seeing that. Maybe I am actually insane. For whom was he writing? For the future, for the unborn. His mind hovered for a moment. So he's recalling the time of the present because he thinks that by acknowledging that, it will change the future. And he's correct, by the way. The one who determines time and history determines the future, which is why I have great Christian hope, by the way. Nobody controls history except the God of history. The Christian faith is a historical faith, by the way. It's the only religion that thinks that history matters to God and that human lives matter to God. It's the chief literary genre of the Bible is history. And God begins history and will put an end to history in the new heavens and the new earth. It has an eschatological dimension, as we would call it in theological circles. But he writes it for the unborn, and his mind hovered for a moment around the doubtful date on the page and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. So now he gets into the genuine problem of communication. If the future is like the present, then they're not going to care about anything that he writes. And if it's different, the meaning of what he's writing about will be meaningless to them. He's lost a sense of the meaning of his own life because he's lost a sense of the meaning of time and history. It's not just time, but history and meaning and purpose. That is the depiction. One final book that you might want to look is Viktor Frankl's work. Has anyone heard of Viktor Frankl? Read him in your psychology classes? Prisoner at Auschwitz. The name of the book will come right up. Man's Search for Meaning. 1946, chronicling his experience as a prisoner in Nazi concentration camps. He observed that those who had a sense of meaning in their lives, those who were religiously motivated, survived more regularly than those who had no such purpose and meaning. And by the way, he lost his whole family, his wife, in the concentration camp. It's a good read. But it's about, again, a place where he is dehumanized and a sense of meaningless and purposelessness overcomes them. If you have no sense of purpose in your life, it's really hard to live your life. We're at the point in the semester when people are wanting to give up a little bit. I hope that you do not give up on life. It is meaningful and it is purposive. You were brought here. No, I'm serious about this. You were brought here. You chose to be here, but actually there were purposes above and beyond yours that ordained your time here. You've come here, and there is a meaning to what has come. You might not have figured out the meaning yet, but there is a meaning to it, and there's a purpose to it. And this is the encouraging thing about the idea that God created space and time and human beings in it, is that he has a meaning and a purpose for everybody who is living. And the meaning and purpose is very connected with his own purposes. And his own purposes, we see, are demonstrated at the cross when he gives his life for ours. That's a very meaningful act and a world-changing act. It's one that changes the conception of time and meaning and history. As we can acknowledge here, even Mr. Winston Smith, when he writes down the date of that, and he lacks that meaning and purpose there. So he's not able to survive on his own. He doesn't have that. He's not like Viktor Frankl, but he's got enough in him to protest feebly against the constraints that are being put on him by Big Brother. And that's enough to make him the hero of 1984. I'm going to stop there for now, and I'll pick up next time. I haven't got very far in book one, so I'll deal with part 1 and part 2 next time. And please just read on. Thank you.